All right, last class period, we finished up the war for independence. We have America winning. We have the treaty establishing our independence there, the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And I read you a quote by Washington where he's recognizing the hand of providence, the hand of God in establishing our country. I think it's good for us to recognize that. We do have a very, very special country, at least as it was founded. And we better appreciate what we have while it's still here. Today I would like to look at some of the bits and pieces of our country getting started, looking at the Articles of Confederation, then looking at the Constitution and why we needed the Constitution, and get up through the Constitution being ratified. The next class period we will look at the separation of church and state and begin to look at how our founding fathers went from a document that described how our country is supposed to be run, the national government anyway, to how they put it into practice and actually get institutions together based on that. But today the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution and how we get about it. All right, let's start with the Articles. The Articles of Confederation were adopted in 1781, right in the middle of the war. The treaty was in 1783. That ends it. So as Yorktown is culminating and all of that, we get these Articles of Confederation approved by the states. They actually go through that Second Continental Congress in 1777. It takes 4 years for the states to approve them, and we begin having our country governed by this new national structure, the Articles of Confederation. And that really is what it is. It's the first attempt for one government united over all of the colonies. Prior to this, there were 13 separate colonies, and we had this Continental Congress that really didn't have any authority. You know, they tried to hold things together through the war, didn't have anything. We now have a legitimate national government. It was weak and effective, and we'll talk about some of those reasons, but this was the first attempt at that national government. Before we get down to some reasons why this was weak and ineffective, I want to mention two laws that are passed during the time frame that were under the Articles of Confederation to go through Congress that get reapproved under the Constitution and have some sway and become significant. So, the first one was proposed by Jefferson himself had a major hand in developing this one. It was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance of 1785. Both of these laws dealt with the Northwest Territory, and at this point in history, don't think of Washington State and Oregon. Think of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, that part of the world, that Ohio River Valley we've seen come up before. What this did, the Land Ordinance of 1785, the basic thought is that it set up a system for the land to be sold to private citizens. At the start of things here, as the articles are formed and we begin to be governed by them, this is all owned by the federal government, the national level. And this set up a system for that land to be subdivided and sold. There was some debate, and it's come up through the years as we have different pieces of land to sell off, about whether this land should be made readily available to people and just sell it cheap to let people begin to live on it and populate it, or if the government should maximize the price and try to get a profit off of it and try to fund the government with it. The decision here was to distribute it. And I think, generally speaking, it's best to get land and property out of the national government's hand. They own way too much property. But it set up this system. The property was surveyed. There were north and south lines. And it was chopped up into 1 square mile block. Some of those were chopped into quarters, and so on. And the law said that they had to be sold for at least $1 per square mile. That's a gigantic hunk of land. I might take 2 or 3, but $1 per square mile was the minimum price that had to be sold here. So this entire area, most of it gets surveyed, and still to this day, there are lots of north-south boundaries between counties, lines that follow these divisions. If you go out further east, there's all kinds of curvy roads and weird boundaries. This Ohio River Valley area has much nicer lines in lots of places, and it harkens back to this law in 1785. All right, the other piece of legislation deals with this same area, and it's called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The land ordinance set up a system for the land to be sold, get it into the hands of the private people. This Northwest Ordinance set up a system for these areas to begin to develop a state government, or to develop and eventually become states. All right, it was just this territory controlled by Congress. There was no structure at all there, and it set up a system for that to happen. The details are not super important. I'll give some of them to you. But the first kind of plateau was once there were 5,000 adult males, sorry girls, free males, living in the territory, they began to choose their own legislative assembly. Prior to that, Congress had picked the rules and legislation. Now they began to have their own legislature, and they played a role in that. The governor of the territory would still be picked by Congress, but that step would be taken. Once they get to 60,000, then that territory could write a state constitution, could apply to become a state, and if approved through Congress, which is the appropriate body for that, they could be admitted as a state. That was the basic progress that they went through. That is not super important. What is important is the decision was made that these states that were being added in would come in on equal footing. It wasn't going to be that the original 13 have some sort of special powers and abilities in Congress, and the others are on lesser levels or lower tiers. Equal footing. So we have this precedent from the very beginning of states being added on equal footing and not some hierarchy of when they came in or if they're original states or not original states. So the Northwest Ordinance set up that program, that system for this area to organize into territories and then become states. And we can know the states that come out of this today. All right, now let's talk about some weaknesses of the Articles. They were, like I said, the first attempt at a national government. In a lot of ways, they're a little bit of an overreaction. We had underneath the king and parliament before a very oppressive, very controlling government that was infringing and too centralized. Here, the Articles, in fear of that, they really ran too far to this side and set up a government that was ineffective. It was given a job to do, but not the capacity to do it. So a little bit of an overreaction with the Constitution. We see it come back much more to a balanced position where the national government has some legitimate powers and also a legitimate amount of authority to get those powers and duties accomplished. So let me give you here some things that made this one not effective, why it was too weak. So a list here of several things, six of them, altogether. All right, the first one is that 9 states had to approve something before it became a law. That might not seem like a big deal, but they needed 9 out of 13 to agree. Today in Congress, it's just more than half of the representatives there have to vote to make something a law. 9 out of 13 is a significantly higher percentage and difficult. All right, so it's this legislative body was just very slow and difficult to get anything done. The Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance are amazing that they came out of this thing, and they actually are pretty good. So very, very difficult to pass any piece of legislation because of this 9 out of 13 policy. Second thing is there's no executive branch. Now today maybe we would glory in not having a president and the whole executive branch disappearing. But there really is a need for it. We need a person to be the executive of the government, to execute the things that Congress passes. And if they pass a law, wanting to put up a fence along the border, who's going to build the fence? Who's going to hire the contractors? Who's going to get that thing done? And that gets thrown to the president, his department, to get that done. Now, it would be fun to see members of Congress approve a fence along the border, and then they go to the hardware store and start digging holes and putting up fence posts. That's not going to happen. But the executive branch is the one that actually does that. Same thing with the military. Who's going to head up the military? Who's going to head up the FBI, the law enforcement? All of these things. There needs to be an executive. And under the Articles, there wasn't that. All right. There was an executive committee, a smaller group of members of the legislative body that kind of acted like this executive, but not a single person. All right. There are times, and very legitimate times, where there needs to be just one person who can make some decisions and get things done. So there's no executive. A third weakness here is no judicial branch. There was no court system. Now, there's no national court system. There were state courts, there were local courts, those things still existed. But there was no court system on the national level. If there was a dispute about the articles and what they said or something, it would go to the state courts, and all 13 states would have their own courts, and you get different decisions, and a very confusing mess. Now, I would agree readily that our current court system has run amok of their constitutional duties and just abused their powers flagrantly. But that does not negate the idea that there does need to be some place for a national judicial system. And there was none here under the Articles of Confederation. So, all right, a fourth weakness of these articles is they had no power to tax. Now, if you actually read the articles, if you really get bored sometime, you can pull them out and read them. They're ready and available. It'll talk about them passing taxes and what's required to pass taxes and things like that. But there's no way to enforce it. Be like me saying, everybody in Northwest Indiana needs to pay me $10, and I just stand outside my front door with my hand out and wonder why nobody comes. I don't have a police force. I don't have anybody that could actually go out and make people come and pay me $10. And that really was the position this Congress was put in. They could pass taxes. They could say, all right, everybody, all the states put in this much, or however they wanted to split it up. But there was no enforcement, no way to make sure that thing happened. All right, so in the end, there is no power to tax. That's the bottom line. They could ultimately request and ask and plead for money, but no real power to tax. Some places, some people define government as the power to tax, and there's legitimate thought to there. If there's an institution that can force you to give them money, then they're very much talking about a government institution, and they do not have that power. All right, the next weakness of the Articles, basically the same thing as taxing, but now it was for the army, the military. All right, they were very much handicapped in figuring out and establishing a military. The thing they could do was request troops from the states. If they wanted to have some sort of patrols on the border or patrolling the ocean, or they're fearful of an attack from someplace, they had to request troops from the states. There was no national army. There weren't troops that they had ready at their disposal. They could request troops from the states. So again, basically no army, or at least backed into the corner of having to request them from the states. So a very, very weak position, especially if you think of the government structure, one of their really at the heart primary tasks is to defend us from foreign invasion and attack. And we don't give them ready access to any type of military. That's a major flaw and weakness. And then the last one is this national level had no control over interstate commerce. All right. At first, this didn't seem like a big deal, but states began to tax each other. They began to get into these feuds back and forth of people that live on one side of the border and want to come into the other state and sell things, and taxing and contention building between states over this thing. Eventually, under the Constitution, we have that power given to Congress. And they're able to just say no taxes for crossing state lines and that type of thing. But here, no control over interstate commerce. So we did have states taxing each other. And there's some feuds that break out between states about taxing and that type of thing. Okay, so the Articles. The first attempt here at forming a national government, at its heart, was just too weak. Right? Not to say that these people were stupid, but they were trying to stay away from the autocratic, oppressive government that they just fought a war to get rid of. And they went a little bit too far on the weak side. And they realized that very, very quickly. It wasn't, 25 years later that somebody's looking at this thing and saying, wow, what did we do? They realized it very, very quickly. And that leads us directly into the next section of our notes. I've got it labeled the critical period in the Constitution. Critical period in the Constitution. The critical period That's the time where our government was governed, where our country was governed by the Articles of Confederation. It was a very, very critical time. We had our country facing major national and world affairs and issues, and a government that was too weak to really address and deal with them. So we were very much in a vulnerable position. And then we'll look at the actual convention and a little bit of the debate and argument that goes on there. So, first of all, the critical period. The years for that, if you want them, are 1781, the year that we begin to be operating under the Articles of Confederation, through 1789. That's the year that we begin to operate under the Constitution. So those 8 years we have as the critical period. Let me mention 3 things here that cause this time frame to be so critical, so much on edge, with our country possibly just kind of imploding in upon itself. So the first we already actually mentioned, but I think it's worth restating here. One thing that made this period so critical was the Articles of Confederation. Those weaknesses and things there left us very, very vulnerable. So that's one problem. A second problem was, I just have it generally labeled, foreign problems. We have this brand new country being formed, and at the heart of it, nobody gave us any respect. A lot of people thought we were going to just kind of fall apart and splinter into 13 different countries, or who knows what number of different countries. So we have England leaving troops on American soil, other countries just kind of rude and offhandedly dismissing us with trade, Spain paying Indians to attack our settlers, and we have all that kind of stuff going, and a national government who doesn't have any way to deal with it. Please give us some troops so we can go handle this, or going to negotiate with France, they helped us in the war, but they really didn't take us very seriously. Going to talk to them, or Spain or England, and those countries know that the fact that you have no military, have no teeth in what you're wanting to do. So these foreign problems, this lack of respect there, and really nothing to do about it, was one major issue. And again, the Articles of Confederation magnify that. We would have had those foreign problems anyway, but with a little more robust central power, central government, we wouldn't have been able to handle them, which is what we do basically. We get rid of those, we have the Constitution written, and then Washington and the first few presidents deal with those things. All right, so we have the Articles, we have foreign problems, and then the third thing is economic problems. Our country was in a very, very bad economic situation. We were in debt from the war. There were soldiers that hadn't gotten paid from the war, and time was dragging on, and they weren't getting paid. We had England preventing us from trading across in all their ports and things like that. So we're getting hampered on the oceans. Our currency was very, very bad, in the sense that nobody trusted this weak government and kind of expected it to fold. So when you go to buy things from other countries, they're looking at this money and saying, I don't know if I want it. And so it becomes very, very low in value. So some major economic problems that we were facing. So this critical period, it was a time where we were kind of bouncing back and forth on the bubble about whether we'd fall over and just completely collapse, or fall on the side of establishing ourselves as a government. It was a very, very critical time. So there's one example here that's often looked at as, or one issue, one event that's looked at as an example of kind of the emotion and how critical things were at this point. This was an event, an internal event that took place. It didn't involve foreign countries, but things like this springing up from within could have been just as bad. This thing is called Shays' Rebellion. Takes place in 1786, towards the second half of this critical period. And what happened in Massachusetts was the state government there raised taxes high, property taxes high, to try to pay off their debt. Some of their major expenses from the war, trying to pay those things off. And the taxes had gotten high enough that quite a few farmers were losing their farms. They couldn't keep up with the taxes, so the government would foreclose on them, sell the farm, and pay the taxes that way. So eventually, in 1786, a man named Daniel Shay, who had been an officer in the military, led an uprising of eventually about 2,000 farmers trying to stop this. They went to several of the courts where the proceedings were taking place and physically shut them down so that the judges couldn't process the foreclosure paperwork. Tried to get a hold of an arsenal so they'd have more weapons. So anyway, this thing it did not blow up like it could have. But you have about 2,000 people at one point, very agitated and coming out to protest and stop this thing. Eventually, the state militia comes out and it does settle down and doesn't blow up like it could have. But it gives you some indication here of the tenuous condition we were in. All right, so the critical period was a very, very touchy time. And our founding fathers realized that very quickly, that things had to change. And that gets us then to the Constitution. And the first thing there is the actual meeting of delegates to write the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention. So the meeting started on May the 25th of 1787 in Philadelphia. And they meet all the way through it, September the 17th of that year when they actually produced the Constitution. And the delegates there signed it, and it's sent off to the states for their approval. But May the 25th, 1787, these guys begin to meet in Philadelphia. Should mention initially here, they were not originally sent there to revise the Articles of Confederation. I'm sorry. They were not sent there to write a new Constitution. They were sent there to just revise the articles. Everybody knew they were too weak and something had to happen. So they were originally going to take the articles, make some changes and adjustments to them to give the government a little more power to accomplish its needed jobs. Very quickly, these delegates realized that it was so flawed it wasn't worth trying to fix. And they wanted to come up with a completely new document, a completely new structure. And they decided to, rather than amend the articles, to write a new constitution. A little bit of a step of faith on their point, because that wasn't something that they were given the authority to do. But obviously, it worked out. All right. Also, something of very important in this convention is they chose George Washington as the president. He doesn't speak a whole lot at the convention because he's the president, recognizing people to speak and that type of thing. But it gave this meeting some instant seriousness and gravity and respect, him being the president of this thing. And besides him, there was really an amazing group of guys that gathered at this thing. A total of 55 attended, and some very, very educated, very knowledgeable, very experienced people. George Washington, James Madison, Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson. There's an amazing group of men here that formed to write this Constitution. All right, there was a total of 55 of them, and they had very different ideas at times. But there was enough coolness in the room that they realized they were going to have to give and take. Not everybody's going to get everything they wanted. They're going to have to compromise, and not in a bad sense, compromise on their positions with the others who had a different opinion in the room. And we get out of this some very significant things in our Constitution, so much so that it's called the Bundle of Compromises. All of the amendments, or not all the amendments, all the different phrases in the Constitution, many of them are compromises of two opposite positions. I mean, even things like how long the president is going to serve. There were people that thought he should serve a one-year term, and others thought he should be elected for life. All right, and if you don't know, they settled on 4 years, kind of in the middle. But there are lots of things like that where these guys come in with different ideas and they reach some sort of agreeable position in the middle. I want to mention 3 of them that are the more significant ones, at least in my mind, of these compromises. The first one, it's obviously important because it's called the Great Compromise. We can tell by the title. It's called great because it does deal with the whole structure of Congress and just the great pieces of the puzzle here. The Great Compromise, the two opposite opinions in this thing had to do, both of them, it was all dealing with the legislature. And one group wanted a bicameral legislature. That means two bodies like we have today, a Senate and a House. Most of the states had a bicameral legislature. They wanted a bicameral legislature where the representation was based on population, and both parts So if you had a state with a lot of population, then you would get more representatives. You might guess that the larger states liked this plan. All right, one of those large states was Virginia. It's called the Virginia Plan. The small states came up with a different idea. They started, they thought that idea didn't sound so good because they were going to get basically completely eliminated. They were so small. Their votes would be swamped by the large states. So the small states, led by New Jersey, came up with the New Jersey Plan. And what this said, what their proposal was, a unicameral legislature, just one legislative body, and the representation there would be fixed, just a certain number per state. Their idea was 2 per state. So it doesn't matter how big or how small your state is, 2 per state. All right, so you can see the large state, the small state plan, and they compromise at a position in the middle. If you're familiar with the way things work in Congress today, there's a bicameral legislature, 2 bodies. The lower house, the House of Representatives, is based on population. So the states with lots of people, California, Texas, have a lot of representatives. And the states with small populations like North Dakota have smaller numbers of representatives. So based on population. The upper house, the Senate, is just a flat 2 per state. North Dakota and California get 2 members of the Senate, 2 senators. So we compromise on those 2 issues. And I think a very appropriate compromise. One house, one part of it represents the fact that we're, individual citizens of this country. The other recognizes that we have 50, or not this point, but now 50 states, and recognizes the state government structure. So very, very appropriate. And that difference was intentional in their minds. All right, so that was the Great Compromise. All right, another one is the 3/5 Compromise. This one gets abused by people. Let me just tell you what it is, and then we can talk about the right way to view it. Here, the split was between the North and the South. They had 2 different opinions. And it had to do with representation. We talked about that lower house where the more population you have, the more people you get to send. And also had to do with taxes. And the way taxes worked originally in the Constitution was the more population you had, the more you paid in taxes. It was based on population. So the North felt that it would be fair and right for the South to count the slaves when they were figuring out how much they had to pay in taxes, but not count the slaves at all when they were figuring out how much they got to send to the House of Representatives, to the legislative body. So count the slaves for taxes, don't count them for representation. That was the Northern position. You can probably guess the Southern position is completely opposite. The South said, well, let's not count the slaves when we're figuring out taxes, but let's do count the slaves when we're figuring out representation. Wanted complete opposite positions. And the compromise is kind of built into the name. They decided to count the slaves as 3/5 for both taxes and representation. So if there's 1,000 slaves in one state, multiply that by 3/5, you get 600. They would count as 600 in the population for both situations. Sometimes people criticize this compromise by saying, the founding fathers of the Constitution claims that black people are only 3/5 of a person or something like that. That is not what it's saying. Right? It only was talking about representation and taxes. Something much, much more critical is the fact that it never calls them property. At this point, the South claimed that their slaves were property, like a desk or a chair or a bookcase. All right, the Constitution calls them people, never recognizes them as property. That is significant. All right, the other part was just a compromise dealing with representation and taxes. They were not claiming them to be 3/5 of a person. They were claiming, the North here, insisting they were people. And we can argue about how we count the population for taxes and representation. So the 3/5 compromise. All right, the last one we can cover quickly here is the Commerce Compromise. It has to do with commerce. And the particular facet of commerce was import taxes, whether or not we would have one or not. The North was in favor, but they wanted to have it built in that there's a tax on imports into our country. The South was against it. They wanted no tax. on things being brought into our country. And it mostly had to do just with their economies. The North was a heavy manufacturing center, so they were shipping things overseas all the time. And they didn't want the overseas countries to be able to send stuff in and compete with their domestic manufacturing. The South, they were importing all kinds of stuff from other countries because they produced lots of agricultural goods, not a lot of manufacturing. So they didn't want a tax on imports because they were going to have to pay it. They didn't want it. So the compromise here was basically that Congress could decide. Once the structure is together, if a majority of Congress wants to have a tax on products coming in, they can do it. It's left up to Congress to decide. So it was not written explicitly in the Constitution. It was left up to Congress to decide that. So there are other examples of things like that, but I think that is sufficient there. You see the compromising that was done to give us our Constitution. So, all right, these guys meet all through the summer, May through September. Finally, in September, 39 of these guys that are there sign this thing, and that does not make it law. Right? These guys were not somehow the monarchs of our country. They could shove it down our throats. They signed it, and the Constitution itself said that once it had been approved by 9 states, it would then become the law for those 9. 9 was not just a random pick. That was going back to the Articles of Confederation that said 9 out of 13 had to approve something. So they were saying, once we get that 9, it'll go into effect for the 9 that approve it. So September the 17th of 1787, it gets sent off to the states for this ratification. And it goes through the different states. Each state has arguments and debates, and then there's an election and voting and that type of thing to decide if it's going to be ratified or not within their states. Eventually, we get the 9, but Virginia and New York had not ratified it yet, and really without those two, it just geographically wouldn't work. Eventually, New York ratifies it on July the 26th. That'd be 88, and then it was the spring of 89 that we actually began to function underneath this Constitution. July the 26th, New York approves it. Then there's got to be elections to choose people for the House. You've got to choose a president. All that type of stuff has to be done, and they actually meet in 1789. So that's when we have the government beginning to function under this new Constitution. So I do need to mention a couple other things before we finish here. The first one is 2 different groups of people that come up during this debate process in all the states for or against the Constitution. The first group is the Federalists. These are people who were in favor of the Constitution. They produce a big, we published it as a book, but it wasn't originally a book, but they produced the Federalist Papers written by Madison and Hamilton and some of the guys who were at the convention arguing for the Constitution. If you ever want to figure out what those guys were intending, you can read it. It's not hidden. It's really aggravating when liberals today completely twist the Constitution to mean something that doesn't. We can go back and we have these guys explaining it. So the Federalist Papers, those are written in trying to argue for the Constitution. If you've ever read those, or if you come to U.S. Constitution class, you'll get to read some of those. They're not light reading. You have to really have your brain engaged and be thinking. But they were written for the common person. It wasn't a law school document that you had to dig through to become a lawyer. This was just the common people that were going to go vote and decide on this thing. So the other group, we have the Federalists. The other group is the Anti-Federalists. You might guess their position. They were opposed to the Constitution. There's also an Anti-Federalist papers that were produced, but they were against it. Obviously, the Federalists win the day here, and we get the Constitution approved. The other thing I want to mention quickly here is the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They get approved in December of 1791. So a year and a half, basically, after the government starts to function, we have that document amended 10 times, 10 changes made to it. We won't go into the history of that, but in Virginia, there was some back and forth about whether or not the Baptists would approve or be on the side of ratifying the Constitution. And we get a promise by Madison to propose these amendments and being added to the Constitution. What I'd like to do here more than that is just briefly talk about the arguments for or against the Bill of Rights. Now, hopefully there's something in you that says, well, of course we want a Bill of Rights. Who wouldn't? But there were some legitimate arguments against it that I think we should at least mention. And we have people like Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers arguing that we don't need a Bill of Rights. That was one of the reasons why the Anti-Federalists were against it, because it didn't have a Bill of Rights, and he was arguing that it's not needed. So let me mention the two sides. First of all, the one that I think is easy to deal with is the people that are for a Bill of Rights. And if you're wondering, this is the side I fall down on. Not that the other side doesn't make a good point, but I think the argument for the Bill of Rights carries the more weight. The basic argument on the side for the Bill of Rights is that governments are always going to expand. They're going to, it's kind of like, melting Jell-O, just kind of oozes everywhere. It's going to expand. And we need to have very definitive boundaries of certain areas that it can't go into. All right? And that's what the Bill of Rights, it kind of put up those fences and says, whatever happens, you got to stay out of these areas. And I think that is the more, the weightier argument. You can look through history at governments that just expand and amass more power to themselves, and there being a need for this Bill of Rights. So, the other side, those arguing against it, again, Alexander Hamilton argues against it in the Federalist Papers. Not that these guys were stupid, but I don't think their argument carries as much weight. Their basic argument is this, that if the Constitution never gives the government the ability to do something, why do we need to tell it can't? If I came into class and said, nobody's allowed to sit on the ceiling today, look at me and say, we don't have that ability. It's kind of a needless rule and restriction. And really, all the things that are listed in the Bill of Rights, that federal government under the Constitution doesn't have any powers to infringe on those things. So they're saying, we don't need this. There's no ability there. They even go one step further, which is worth thinking about. They say, if you make a list of things that the government can't do, even though it's not given the power to do them, then it calls into question anything else. If there's other things, and there are other things that the government's not given the power to do, but what if it doesn't make it on the list? Can the government then, it can kind of do those things even though it doesn't have the power to do them, right? So it brings up that kind of question of, is this the whole list, and ones that don't make it to the list, are they less important or something like that? That is addressed towards the end. Talks about how things not on the list are still reserved to the states or to the people respectively. So they did try to address that, but a legitimate thought at least to think about. Obviously, I think the argument for the Bill of Rights is the weightier one, and historically the problem that governments have had. The other one has not been the major problem. All right, so we get a Constitution, we get a Bill of Rights added to it. Now we just have to take this thing from a piece of paper to actually a government where there's people sitting in chairs passing legislation and a president and putting that whole structure together. Not a small task, but we will deal with that next class period. You're dismissed.